From the earliest days of cinema, filmmakers have looked into the sky and found a broad canvas for their imaginations. Early films were already filled with fantasy and adventure. But as the world became captivated with flight and space exploration, films filled our imaginations with what lay beyond the stars. It is a wonderful coincidence that the beginnings of film and the beginnings of flight coincided. In those days, theaters were filled not only with movies, but actual footage of amazing inventions and discoveries mankind had never seen. In 1903, audiences were dazzled by the achievement of flight at Kitty Hawk. But this created a challenge that filmmakers, in many ways, still face today. How to tell stories more incredible than what real-life explorers endure every day? And what better medium to visualize the places where no human had ever imagined than cinema?
The power of film is that it makes what we can imagine visible on the screen. And I think the power of space travel on film is it makes this amazing possibility and this amazing reality of the human experience visible on the screen.
Movies work best, I think, when they're testing characters in ways that are somehow relatable. Sort of a what-if kind of an experience in the theater. You know, what would I be like in space? What would it be like to be in space?
We hadn't been to the moon, we hadn't been outside the atmosphere of Earth, but we imagined it. And then Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and all the stuff that we were reading about, it was romantic. I mean, it was a romantic concept to travel to the stars. We all knew that we were going to get there eventually, and just like in the future, we're going to have flying cars and moving sidewalks and all the stuff that we were promised, none of which showed up.
Georges Méliès' film, Trip to the Moon, had all the elements of a present-day blockbuster. The film drew on the worlds of science fiction and fantasy to create a journey unlike anything ever seen before. Audiences were amazed by strange creatures, daring escape sequences, and Méliès' signature camera tricks.
I think filmmakers are always looking for another story to tell, going to some place you've never been to before, and where the physics are all different too. There's no gravity, and there could be dangerous creatures you don't know anything about.
If you go back as far as Georges Méliès, you know, his trip to the moon is completely fanciful. It's a fairy tale.
One of the things that attracted me to science fiction films were presentations of environments that didn't exist, or some projection as to what the future might be like. The humor and sort of tongue-in-cheek quality of Méliès' Trip to the Moon, like any great design is, like any new invention is, they showed sort of ingenuity at work, which was great.
I think it's an interesting idea that movies came from stage illusion. You know, in the time of Méliès doing tricks on stage, trying to fool an audience, doing kind of an optical magic show, so to speak, of having props and sets and lights and illusions and stuff. It was stagey. It was a painted backdrop. It was a set. It was props. It was lights on a stage with cameras. And that started to evolve over time into a much more sophisticated art form where you could project a background or superimpose a background or ultimately do a blue screen film background or any other number of stepping stones along the way that made it get better and better.
It's an absolutely conceptual brilliance. And it's even more brilliant because it was something that had never been done before. You know, he was just inventing all of this stuff.
Méliès made no attempt to depict the reality of space. His vision was pure fantasy, inspired by the works of Jules Verne. However, his spectacle was an early masterpiece of visual effects, with illusions that inspired future generations of filmmakers.
The most elaborate achievement of the silent era would be Fritz Lang's film from 1929, Frau im Mond.
Frau im Mond by Fritz Lang was really the first film where they hired a technical expert, Hermann Oberth, and got advice on how one might actually construct a rocket that could fly to the moon. And so that was certainly a quantum leap in realism.
As filmmakers strove for realism, they really didn't have that much to cling to because there wasn't a lot of information. And so for a picture like Woman in the Moon, Fritz Lang would have to just sort of come up with on his own ideas about space travel and how it would work. And so there was a tremendous amount of improvisation. People just had to just go to their imaginations and figure out what makes sense.
Fritz Lang and his team used the research available at the time to speculate on what it would take to get a manned rocket to the moon and back. In Woman in the Moon, their scientific findings were presented as accurately as possible.
There's something wonderful in the vintage representations of space travel, both with what they get right and what they get wrong, and both of those can be compelling and entertaining. And the wonderful thing about Fritz Lang's Frau im Mond is they get so much right.
It's the first film that had a countdown and that moment in which the whole thing is going to be launched. It's a film that, for instance, predicts that a rocket will have different stages, 3 stages, same one as the Apollo rockets. He was already dealing with effects of gravity, for instance.
It was a quantum leap in achieving realism in depicting spaceflight. But of course, he had a few mistakes too. He somehow imagined it would be best to launch the spaceship out of a tank of water, and he posited that they would discover a valley on the far side of the moon that happened to have a breathable atmosphere. So one character puts on a spacesuit, discovers he doesn't need it, and takes it off, and everybody is walking around the moon in shirt sleeves.
Fritz Lang, a filmmaker of Jewish origin, left Germany at an early stage of the Hitler regime. His film, Frau im Mond, was repressed by the Nazis. They withdrew prints of it, and this has given rise to a number of urban legends.
There was this German rocket society with people like Hermann Oberth and Werner von Braun. Nazi Germany thought that rockets could become the secret weapon that would help them win the war. And so they hired people like Oberth and von Braun to build what eventually became the V-2 missiles that rained on London. And they were also afraid that some other country might get into rockets and do the same thing. So they actually started to destroy every print that they could find of Frau im Mond.
The archives of the German propaganda ministry reveal that Goebbels himself, the Nazi propaganda minister, admired this particular film and wanted it to stay in circulation, but he came under tremendous pressure from lower-level people in the Nazi party to repress the film based solely on Fritz Lang's Jewish origin. Although that story is incorrect, it's a testament to the excellent job that Fritz Lang, working with German scientific advisors, it's a testament to what they achieved in the film, that people would think it was a credible story.
Yeah, a lot of the early films that were done were simply guesses as what things might look like. When you got into the 50s, though, with the stuff that Chesley Bonestell brought to Destination Moon and Conquest of Space, they were doing the best they could from what they could see from telescopes from Earth. They just assumed everything was like here with jagged mountain peaks and flat plains.
To me, the films can be windows on the past, and sometimes you get the best view not from a film that was formally discussing politics, but rather a film that was discussing something unrelated, like space travel. And science fiction films depicting an imagined future, can be incredibly revealing. It's really interesting watching George Pal's films, how time and again Cold War issues will come up.
George Pal's 1950 film, Destination Moon, employed science fiction writer Robert A. Heinlein to help research and envision what it would take technologically to send mankind into space.
New time on the integrating computer. 03, 47, 58. 5, 4, 3, 2, fire.
Destination Moon by George Powell was a particularly groundbreaking movie. Disappointing for us kids in that there were no monsters on the moon, but it was very scientific, as much as you could be in those days. And the moonwalk was astonishingly similar to the first moonwalk. I mean, everybody I knew was remarking on it. Is this really a scene from Destination Moon, or is this really happening?
Well, I saw Destination Moon when I was very young. I would rate that in my own response to it at the time as being kind of hokey and corny. I remember as a kid just not being impressed. I was very scared, nevertheless, and I went on a hike and there was this clay ground that had been broken and crushed like the surface in Destination Moon, and it completely freaked me out. I went hysterical. I suddenly thought, I'm on the moon and I'm gonna die. So it had an effect on me.
We can watch Destination Moon and say, they were trying their best, but I can see this is a film set, and I can see he's on wires.
Though the filmmaking techniques might have struggled to keep up with George Powell's vision, audiences were along for the ride on this tense drama enhanced by what was advanced technologies for the time. A far cry from the astronauts in sweater vests seen in earlier films. Cinema was swiftly making its shift from fantasy toward realism.
Destination Moon introduced the realistic spacesuit. So I think the spacesuit is the key image. If you have a character in a spacesuit, you are telling viewers these people are in a dangerous environment.
Ain't that something? Destination Moon, another thing that already has is all these systems for how to deal with gravity or lack of gravity. You know, and then they have these shoes with magnets that when they walk outside the spaceship, you know, they can keep connected to the metal of the spaceship.
I actually just saw for the first time in decades Destination Moon recently to remind me of sort of, I remember how beautiful some of it was. They built a model of the spaceship that they had to take off and had to launch in the desert, I think at nighttime, and they had some sort of exhaust in the back that was a fire thing, and it was, I think the model was about 3 feet tall and lifted with wires that you, of course, couldn't see. And the problem is that the characteristic of the smoke and the flame that came out made it look about as big as it really was, and that's a very difficult thing to fix. The trick is making it aesthetically wondrous, and that film had some wondrous scenes to me that really brought back, just seeing it recently, a feeling of being a kid again and looking at this thing. There's a shot of looking down at the moon, and the spaceship is in front of you, and it's sort of rotating to land, and it's lit in silhouette compared to the moon, which it never would be, but it gave it a sense of weight, importance. I mean, somebody made an aesthetic choice that we're breaking the rules of everything to make this moment powerful.
Though Destination Moon made incredible predictions of the future, a new age would dawn less than 10 years later. The fantasy of traveling to the stars and of watching a human plant their feet on the surface of the moon would begin to materialize on October 4th, 1957, with the launch of Sputnik.
They had no idea how incredibly complicated and difficult it is to get from point A to point B in outer space. So the actual space program was quite a revelation to filmmakers, and they really had to change the way they depicted space travel to accord with what people were seeing on television.
Rush's 1957 film, Road to the Stars, was a fantastic speculation on what the future of space travel would yield. A film that would later heavily influence 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was indicative both of the real-life imagery on television sets and the possibilities of what could result from the Cold War-fueled space race. A human being planting their feet on the moon.
Space became a means of propaganda, you know, both of the Soviets and the Americans. It was like a Cold War by proxy. And because of that, space started to really come into the living rooms of people. It started to be part of media culture. And when I was growing up in the 60s, well, it was news every single day.
Of course, as the Apollo program was getting off the ground and orbiting the moon and eventually landing on the moon, the original Star Trek was on the air. But it got generally poor ratings. It was canceled after 3 years. So it's like at the time, people were still more interested in the actual space program than a story like Star Trek.
Perhaps that's why Star Trek did poorly on its first run on television. It failed to measure up to the real-life drama of the Gemini and the Apollo programs. Its focus on aliens and creatures set in a far distant future lacked the harsh reality of the Cold War drama taking place in the news. One film that looked to capture the real-world drama and danger of space travel was the 1969 film Marooned.
Marooned was the first film in that period in which took a very scientific and technological approach. What is interesting about Marooned is that it's about 3 astronauts that are stranded in space and the mission to rescue them. And this film was released 1 year before Apollo 13, foreshadowing what was going to happen later on. And it had this very hopeful thing towards the end when this Russian mission ends up helping to save the day. And for me as a kid, it was a very moving thing that in the midst of the Cold War, the rescue and the happy endings happens because of collaboration with the Soviets. And it was a film in which every single reality in space was highly respected. The visual effects were absolutely superb. They're really, really good.
Suddenly, the world was ready for a different kind of film, a new vision of reality.
I think Steven Spielberg referred to 2001 as the Big Bang of space films, and it most certainly was. I mean, Stanley Kubrick took us into space like we'd never been before.
2001 was right at the cusp. We landed on the moon in 1969, and we didn't know exactly what it was going to look like. I had huge arguments with Stanley about what I thought the lunar terrain would look like. And I was correct, but he got his way. He wanted to look like Chesley Bonestell, you know, craggy mountains and all this stuff. But it didn't hurt the film.
It was really the first time that space looked and felt real, and the physical laws were acknowledged, and it wasn't just a game. It was, you know, it was a part of the human experience.
With 2001, Stanley Kubrick created the most visually striking space film ever. The mysterious imagery tested audiences' separation of reality and fantasy. The result made a profound impact on how the public imagined space.
I was an artist when I was a kid. I did a lot of drawing and painting and that kind of stuff. And I became involved in photography. I started really liking photography. And about the time I became, had an avocation in photography, I saw 2001, Space Odyssey. And the Space Odyssey, to me, was the first film that I had seen where you kind of could believe it, because it was a masterful sort of execution with scientific plausibility and an interesting, although somewhat complex, story.
It was being touted as the ultimate science fiction movie, and a lot of the fans felt a little threatened by, you know, this, because, well, what about our pictures? What about the ones that we like? You know, they're all chopped liver now? And as it turned out, they really kind of were chopped liver compared to 2001, which was a quantum leap in not just filmmaking, but in the treatment of science fiction.
When Kubrick did 2001, he just pushed all that space effects level or whatever it is to something else, you know, being a filmmaker, not an effects person. And the spaceship, you know, tiny, tiny going by with this massive asteroid, not just a big asteroid, but a massive asteroid. So you've got the imagination of these guys, these really brilliant filmmakers, and they will conceive things that are beyond what we know how to do.
Working with visual effects pioneer Douglas Trumbull, Kubrick advanced the techniques of filming miniature props to a stunning level of realism they had never reached before. These elaborate camera tricks were a direct descendant of the multiple exposures that Méliès had done in Trip to the Moon back in 1902.
Well, Méliès was one of the first people I know of who was actually doing camera tricks, you know, treating the film as something that you can change the time sequence on.
In many ways, he used all the technologies that we keep on using nowadays. He's the first pioneer of matte painting, for instance. The principles are the same. You take one image and then you superpose that image into another one and you just create layers. And the trick is in the integration of those layers.
The technology that we have been working with over the years has obviously improved greatly, but not to the point where we don't still look back on the things that were done and find ways to implement those techniques.
The art of multiple exposures, one layered on top of another, is a technique Méliès pioneered, which combined live-action footage, miniature photography, and matte paintings together in one composited shot. Méliès used this technique to great effect to make rockets crash and Greek goddesses float. But in 2001, A Space Odyssey, the filmmakers found that if they moved the camera multiple times across a miniature of a ship, each time lighting a different layer, the result was fluid motion that was both poetic and believable.
There was this motion control system that Wally Weavers built for 2001, which was very successful in allowing a certain amount of camera freedom, but all the movements are constant speed. And that technical limitation of just having a whole bunch of motors connected together electronically and they're all running at the same speed, that gave the movie this kind of balletic constant motion, almost like a dance, which in retrospect made the Blue Danube Waltz work. And Kubrick certainly didn't anticipate that, and he wouldn't find out until he cut the movie and then started looking for a musical score, and then suddenly you see, oh, now these two things fit together. This kind of music and this kind of motion fit together. And it was called the Sausage Factory because we're just gonna crank out shots like crazy. It's a factory, we're gonna manufacture shots, it's gonna be easy, fast, and simple. That was not true. It took forever.
It took a lot of work and a lot of time on their part. And they also wanted to make sure there was no side effect of an optical compositing, no grain increase, a pristine, sharp picture shot in 70 millimeter, seeing it on a big screen. And I saw the opening night in LA and I was just blown away by it. And all my friends were scratching their heads saying, what was that about? And I just said, I don't know what it was about, but I don't care. One of the most amazing things I've ever seen.
Kubrick's technical innovations, along with his understanding of how to communicate the vastness of space, made a considerable impact on a whole generation of filmmakers. These young filmmakers took Kubrick and Trumbull's new benchmark for success and pushed the imaginations of audiences even further to worlds they never before imagined.
I think that the work of miniatures in 2001 was fundamental for the work of miniatures in Star Wars. This whole lesson that Kubrick gave about depth. The whole point of Star Wars from the beginning is to see the depth of the miniature passing on top of the camera and making them be not only look big, but for them to have depth. The inner lighting of the miniatures. And we would use miniatures from the lessons learned from Trumbull and Kubrick in 1968.
The challenges that were posited to us was, how do we make a camera travel 30 miles an hour and stop in 3 inches? Or how do we make a camera that's 4 feet across or 4 inches across come within an inch of a subject matter to make it look big? So the approach was really about overcoming challenges, limitations in the technical world. And the references to the original films were great because it told us how to do what they couldn't do.
Well, John Dykstra had the idea of doing the next version of motion control because he'd worked with Trumbull. The motion control technology, I believe, was first used in the machine industry, on mills, on cutting steel. That then turned into what was sort of on the 2001 stuff, which kind of turned into what was on Star Wars with these robotic arms moving things around.
And at that point, there had been some films that used miniatures to do aerial battle work, but there were some limitations to what the camera could do. And the key to it was that the camera was always in motion. And that was something that at the time we were setting about doing this was doable, but only with very, very complex techniques.
The science fantasy that was brought to Star Wars really was based on what looked good and what sounded good. I mean, very obviously, if you look for it, they're flying like airplanes.
Star Wars created a thrilling ride for audiences. Here was a work of pure fantasy, yet it felt real and tangible to audiences.
When I look at representations of space and science fiction in film, it strikes me that the filmmaker has to show a new level of immersiveness. The filmmaker has to show a new way in which they are able to transport the audience. And this places a tremendous burden on the special effects people to do something new and powerful, because the stakes are now very high.
You know, when the Star Wars Jaws phenomenon happened and movies started to switch into spectacle mode, you know, that became the dominant genre in movies. But I think there's also a need to tell real stories. And things like Apollo 13 and The Right Stuff are correlatives to Star Wars. They were real stories. These are things that actually happened to real people. And the technology now exists to present it in a very believable way.
Star Wars kicked off a renaissance that harkened back to the space film's fantasy roots, inspiring a new version of Buck Rogers and Battlestar Galactica. Philip Kaufman's 1983 film, The Right Stuff, was one of the first realistic space films based on documented history. The film went to great lengths to make sure this true story was told with realistic visuals. The technology now existed to accurately depict the details of the Mercury missions with the power of the big screen.
If you look at the history of manned space flight, you can see that all along the way, fiction and dramatic representations of space have been incredibly important. The first generation of scientists were inspired by people like Jules Verne. We know that the German rocket scientists loved Fritz Lang's movie Frau im Mond and painted a picture of his rocket on the nose cone of their prototype rockets during World War II. And then in our own time, astronauts talk about having been inspired by The Right Stuff.
That scene of Glenn re-entering is one of those scenes in which I think is so researched. The realism and the emotional reality is absolutely stunning.
The urge to use filmmaking to communicate the realities of space has never been more evident than in the 1995 film Apollo 13.
Apollo 13 was the first movie that I made that was based on real events. And I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I came away from the experience honestly respecting my audience a lot more, because it was exciting to see how meaningful those details and those truths were.
Apollo 13 is a good example of something where everything just is right. They had great reference footage to look at, but they embellished. You know, everything that was going on in that had to be perfect, or else it would have looked bogus.
Ron Howard and his team made the decision to film weightless sequences in actual real-life weightless environments. While many films of the past had put actors in wire harnesses to make them appear to float on screen, Apollo 13 dealt with microgravity in a death-defying way.
We tested wires for Apollo 13, and, you know, it was not only going to be miserable and inevitably look kind of fake. Wire removal at that point was something that was just really brand new and not reliable and very, very expensive. Steven Spielberg was the one who actually gave me the idea that we might be able to shoot doing these parabolas. He said, you know, they used to just bolt the spacecraft down and practice EVAs and weightless maneuvers and things like that. And, I saw footage of it. So then I asked Jim Lovell about it. He said, oh yeah, we used to go up in a thing called the Vomit Comet. I said, do you think you could get us on the Vomit Comet?
The Vomit Comet is an airplane that takes those with strong stomachs high into the air, then nosedives dramatically. Those that are inside the plane, surrounded by set dressing, have the simulated feeling of floating weightless in space, even though they're plummeting violently back down to Earth inside the falling plane.
I mean, the idea of somebody actually going up in a Vomit Comet and filming footage was unheard of.
So we had about 17 seconds to work with, because it took 2 or 3 seconds to get weightless and get in position, and then with about 2 to 3 seconds to go before the plane was finishing its dive and going to pull out. And Tom Hanks kept track, but I think we did between 600 and 700 parabolas in our filming.
Apollo 13 also ushered in a new era of filmmaking tools for storytellers, the digital age. Methods that had been used since Méliès, like optical printing and miniature photography, now had the ability to be enhanced with computer technology.
I like a mixture that's really mostly miniatures and some computer graphics. It's a lot of things to the art of miniatures, but the result is that they age very gracefully. And if you look at the miniatures in Apollo 13, they still look pretty good. They still look convincingly, amazingly powerful.
Especially in like the launch sequence. I worked on that shot for a year, and I mean, I don't even know how many artists ended up touching it. Endless. So, I mean, for that point in time, there really was never a debate, should we do the ship CG? When I think back on Apollo 13, it was a really interesting thing because that was a very extensive use of CG, even for the mid-90s. And now we've come to a point where we can acknowledge that we've achieved photoreal CG. And I know watching Gravity, I couldn't tell you from scene to scene when it was a practical plate versus CG.
Audiences now are so sophisticated. They want to believe what they're seeing, and they want it to be real. And they don't like being taken out of the picture and reminded that they're watching a movie.
When approaching Gravity, Alfonso Cuarón and his creative team looked back on the films of the past in order to determine how or how not to approach filming their story. Miniatures, matte paintings, motion control, wires. Many of the techniques from the past were considered in order to convey what audiences perceived to be the realities of space. Their first challenge was making their actors appear to exist in a real weightless environment. While a vomit comet was considered, it was deemed unnecessary thanks to advancing digital technology.
Well, when they do weightlessness in these films that we've been talking about, like in Destination Moon, you see them floating because they're hanging from wires, but the access in which they float is very limited.
You know, and did a great job for that period, you know. I can't imagine what sort of steel cables they had at that period. But you know, today we don't have to worry so much about wires because it's such an easy thing for the visual effects department to paint them out.
Wire work was and is a tremendous part of being able to do things in special effects terms. You know, we don't ordinarily levitate. You know, it's very hard to find actors who can do that.
We end up using some wires, and we end up having to develop a new system of wires.
The challenges for the actors in Gravity and Apollo 13 were very different. The actors in Gravity, you know, had to really trust their director, trust the technology, and forget the fact that they were physically locked into something very entirely unnatural, and yet give these thoroughly honest, riveting, you know, wonderful performances.
GPS is down.
Also, keys to achieving a photorealistic fantasy story were the use of light and sound. Gravity employed the next generation of motion control cameras, similar to those used by its predecessors, along with a complex interactive lighting system to enhance the drama.
Space is actually pretty easy when you come right down to it, because you got one big solar source that's not very complex lighting-wise. Choosing from where to photograph a subject in that lighting environment is the complex and hard part. It's really composition and pacing, I think, as much as anything, that makes a huge difference in whether you feel the sort of coolness of space.
All right, Sharif, let's do this. Houston, update?
Well, we have a full-on chain reaction. It's been confirmed that it's the unintentional side effect of the Russians striking one of their own satellites.
There's only one source, that is the sun, and not a lot of films have dealt with that accurately. I think that Apollo 13 was one film that was dealing with that situation accurately, and definitely 2001. And that's something that when we were doing Gravity, we were very concerned about dealing with that sense of light.
Light is what movies are made of. I mean, it's painting with light, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the way it would look in order to convince an audience. You only have to convince them that this is the way they think it should look.
You want to put a nice dramatic light on somebody, but it doesn't work. Where's the light come from? Oh, it's a film light to make somebody look dramatic, but actually for the movie, it wasn't right. And it would have been intrusive. That's the other thing.
Even if the principle doesn't look as cool, the consistency is what gives the realism. You know, there's sometimes the temptation to say, well, yes, but if we put a little bounce light over here, it's going to look cooler. Yeah, probably it's going to look cooler if it was a photograph, you know? But when you're doing a film and and it's the accumulation, what it starts to give the sense of reality.
When an audience evaluates a film, it evaluates the film based on reality. It says, is this realistic or not? And so many space films insist on part of their reality being sound. Space is the ultimate silent environment, given that sound waves can't travel in a vacuum. And yet, how many space films have we seen where there are elaborate sound effects, rockets firing, spaceships whooshing?
Well, in space, nobody can hear you scream, and if there's no sound, then there's no scream, and there's no explosions either. But sound has always been a major part of being able to convince people that the unreal is real. And with the addition of 3D and stereophonic sound all over the theater, I mean, you can immerse people into a sort of virtual reality world just at the multiplex. And sound is an incredibly important part of that.
One that did it very well is A Woman in the Moon because it's a silent movie. So there was no sound. But I guess that the first example of how it has to be done was 2001. Then every time that you would cut narratively into space, he had those moments in which ones that atmosphere is drained, the sound is completely gone. And actually, that's something we tried to do with Gravity.
On Gravity, sound was fundamental. The sound of the breathing was essential, and the sound played in a surround sound. Again, the sound was to help create a more immersive experience. That silence and that strangeness, that discomfort, is very important in Gravity because it highlights the character's own discomfort. The breath, the breathing, all those sounds contribute to a sense of anxiety, claustrophobia, discomfort.
The reality of the limitlessness of space, the silence of space, is too disturbing. I think it puts people in mind of the limitlessness that all mortals face, the limitlessness of death.
From Méliès's fantastic Trip to the Moon in 1902 to the achievements of Gravity and beyond, filmmakers continue the tradition of making audiences believe what they are seeing on the screen.
I think it's getting harder to please the audiences. You set the bar high with a movie like Gravity, and they want more. And it's down to us to try and figure out with the director and the visual effects people and the production designer of how we can achieve, the impossible.
Well, the good news now is that visual effects technology has gone to a point in which you can trust the use of that tool. The advantage I have with Gravity is that as opposed to Star Wars or Right Stuff, is that they were still developing those things.
Every day there's new technologies and new developments that make it easier to achieve the things that people struggled so hard to achieve in the 20s and 30s and 40s.
It's just that the tool chest has gotten, so much deeper. The drawers have just gotten, we've added some drawers that are really valuable.
To bring something to the screen that the audience has never seen before, you've got to really be nervy. You have to build a device and say, okay, I'm going to build this thing and we're going to use it, and you've got to be pretty sure it's going to work because you're putting a lot at risk. And then when you make your vision and you make your movie, all that becomes invisible to the audience. They don't care that you built a widget. They just saw a movie they never saw before.
More than ever, it's possible for me to get what's in here onto the screen. Basically, now audiences understand that you can do anything. So what does it mean? Well, what it really means is that it comes back to story. And what is story? It's character.
If you don't care about the characters, then that all is diminished. If you're on a journey with the characters in a film, you're more likely to go on that journey with them.
Cinema is like plays and books. It's about stories, and it's about characters, and it's about interactions, and all of these techniques are useful in that they allow us to tell those stories.
It's the technology enabling a story. They're woven together inextricably in creating an ability to do something that you couldn't do before.
The medium only grows through collaboration and through study. And, you know, on Gravity, as on 2001, as on with Fritz Lang, as with all these great directors, they learn from what came before and they build on that.
When you think how hard it was to make movies in the 30s and 40s and how much easier it is today, your hat really has to go off to the people who really created such amazing illusions in those times under those circumstances.
As the human experience grows, it's just going to challenge filmmakers all the more to find great stories, rich in character detail, that help us understand the answers to those questions that science can never really answer.
As everything in cinema, visual effects and all of these things we're talking about are nothing but tools. And I think that there is a handful of filmmakers nowadays that are really using those tools in order to serve that cinematic language.
Everyone's vocabulary is about life, and visuals is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So you've got a 5-year-old that sees Gravity. That's their level of like norm now for outer space stuff. So they're going to then, when they grow up, if they want to make films, they're just going to want to do something better than that. So I've got no idea what comes from a young mind, 15, 20 years from now.
It's exciting to imagine. What will cinema look like in the year 2125? How will those audiences look back on the films of today when all of these techniques and technologies have become as quaint as bubble helmets and silver rockets?